Dr. Ashworth caught my sleeve at the flap of the ward and said, low enough that only I would hear, "The boy in the corner cot hasn't spoken a word in 11 days, Reverend, and I have run out of medicine for that." I had buried men that week. I had held the hands of boys who would not see morning, and I had written letters home in careful script, so that mothers in Kent and Yorkshire would not know how their sons had actually died. But nothing in those 11 days had unsettled me the way Private Edwin Larkin's silence did, because Edwin was not dying. His shoulder wound was healing clean under the dressing. His fever had broken. He ate what was put in front of him if a nurse guided the spoon to his mouth, and he slept when the laudanum allowed it. What he would not do, what he had not done since they carried him in from the ridge above the donga with his brother's blood dried black on his tunic, was speak. The farmhouse the army had requisitioned for the ward sat on a rise above a dry riverbed, its whitewashed walls scorched gold by a sun that showed no mercy for grief or anything else. We had strung canvas over the yard to make a second ward when the beds inside filled, and the wind off the veld carried dust through every gap in the walls until it settled like a second skin on the linens. It was August, and the heat did not break even after dark. 22 cots stood in 2 long rows in the main room, and against the far wall, incongruous as a hymn sung in a slaughtered yard, stood an upright piano. Nobody quite knew how it had come to be there. Some said it had belonged to the Boer family who once lived in the farmhouse, left behind in their flight, its case scarred where a shell fragment had grazed the wood near the hinge. Others said a supply officer with a soft heart had it hauled up from the rail siding on a gun carriage because he'd read that music was good for morale. Whatever the truth, it stood there with 3 of its ivories yellowed to the color of old teeth, and 1 key in the tenor register gone silent entirely. Its felt hammer split, and it had not been tuned since God knew when. Still, when one of the orderlies banged out a music hall tune of an evening, the men who could sit up would clap along, and for a few minutes the ward sounded like something other than what it was. Edwin Larkin never clapped. He lay on his cot with his good arm across his chest, and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere past the tent pole, past the roof, past whatever the rest of us could see, and he did not move when the piano played, and he did not move when I sat beside him and spoke of God's nearness in suffering, and he did not move when his own mates came to visit and called him by name and begged him, some of them weeping themselves, to say something, anything, to prove he was still in there. I had come to him every day of those 11, dragging a camp stool to his bedside and reading aloud from whatever scripture seemed least likely to condemn a grieving man, though most days I simply sat and let the silence be silence, trusting that presence alone might count for something where words did not. Sister Agnes, who had nursed him first, kept his brother's photograph, a small creased likeness taken before they'd ever left Shropshire, tucked beneath his pillow, thinking he might reach for it in some unguarded hour, but his hand never moved toward it. His kit lay folded at the foot of the cot, exactly as the orderlies had folded it the day he arrived, and there was something in that terrible tidiness, that refusal even to disturb his own belongings, that told me more plainly than any doctor's chart how far away he had gone. I had pieced together what happened from the men who'd been on the ridge, because Edwin himself offered nothing. His brother Samuel, 2 years older, had enlisted with him from the same village in Shropshire, and the two had never once been separated in 19 years of life, until the Boer rifle fire came down off the kopje, and Samuel took a bullet meant, by the cruel arithmetic of battle, for no one in particular. He died with his head in Edwin's lap, the men said, and Edwin had carried him a full half-mile under fire rather than leave him, though there was nothing left to save. When they finally pulled Edwin off his brother's body, he had not screamed or wept. He had simply gone quiet, the way a lamp goes out, and he had stayed that way ever since. It was into this stillness that Clara Winslow came, some 10 days after Edwin was carried in, transferred up from the base hospital at the rail junction because we were short of trained nurses, and she had asked, against the advice of the matron there, to be sent to wherever the need was worst. She was 25, with sun-browned hands and a voice that carried authority without ever rising, and she moved through the ward those first days the way a good nurse does, missing nothing. I noticed her noticing Edwin on her second morning. She stood at the foot of his cot a long moment, studying his face, and then she looked toward the piano against the wall, and something in her expression sharpened, as though she had glimpsed the outline of an idea she did not yet trust. She had trained at a voluntary aid hospital in Bristol before the war took her further than a vicar's daughter from Somerset likely ever imagined going, and she carried herself with the calm of someone who had decided early that usefulness mattered more than comfort. Her hands were roughened by carbolic soap and long hours, but I noticed, watching her change a dressing, that they never lost their gentleness, even when the work itself was hard. She spoke to every man in that ward by name within her first week, remembered which of them dreaded the morning rounds and which welcomed the company, and treated Edwin's silence not as a wall to be respected, but as a door she simply had not yet found the handle to. "He hasn't spoken since his brother died," I told her that evening, when I found her scrubbing basins by lantern light, long after her shift should have ended. "We've tried everything the surgeons know. Dr. Ashworth fears it may simply be how the boy is made now." "I don't believe that," Clara said, not unkindly, but with the flat certainty of someone who has already decided otherwise. "Grief doesn't erase a man. It buries him. There's a difference, Reverend, and the difference matters, because one of those things you can dig a person out of." She began asking questions of the other Shropshire men in the ward, quietly, between rounds, and it was Private Thomas Reed, who had marched in the same company as the Larkin brothers since the depot at Aldershot, who finally told her what she was looking for. I was present for it, sitting with Reed to read him a letter from his wife, when Clara asked whether Edwin and his brother had shared some particular fondness, some habit from home that might reach him. Reed's bandaged leg shifted on the cot, and he looked toward Edwin's still form across the room before he answered. "They used to sing on the march, miss. Not loud. You couldn't sing loud. The sergeant have your hide. Just under their breath. The two of them side by side, keeping step to it. Their mother taught it them on a little parlor piano before they ever left Shropshire. A sweet tune, foreign sounding, though it's an English piece, I believe. Salute of something. Samuel used to say it was the only thing that made the miles shorter." "Salut d'amour," Clara said softly, and something moved behind her eyes, a recognition. "I know it. My own mother had the sheet music. I learned it as a girl, on a piano not so very different from that one." She glanced again at the battered upright with its scarred case and its silent tenor key, and I saw her measuring the distance between what she knew and what she might do with it, the way a person measures the width of water before deciding to cross. She did not attempt it that night, nor the next. I watched her instead in the gaps between her duties, seated at the piano, after the ward had quieted, working through the melody under her breath, testing which keys answered true, and which had gone dead or sour in the heat, learning the instrument's particular wounds the way she had learned her patient's wounds, with patience and without complaint. Twice I saw her ask Dr. Ashworth's permission, and twice he refused her, not unkindly, worried that a sudden performance might overset a mind already so fragile, might do harm where he could offer no remedy. "Let him rest," he said. "Let time do what time does." "Time has had 11 days, Clara answered him on the third evening, and there was iron under the gentleness in her voice now. "I am not proposing a concert, doctor. I am proposing to sit at that piano, as I would sit at any patient's bedside, and play the one thing in this world that might still know his name." Ashworth looked at her a long moment, then at Edwin's cot, then at me, as though seeking some ecclesiastical blessing for a decision that was plainly not his to give away. I said only that I thought God worked as readily through a nurse's hands as through a chaplain's prayers, and that seemed to settle something in him, for he nodded once and turned back to his rounds without another word of objection. So it was that on the 11th evening after Samuel Larkin fell on the ridge above the Donga, as the sun went down blood orange over the veld and the heat of the day finally loosened its grip on the farmhouse walls, Clara Winslow washed the dust from her hands, untied her apron, and walked the length of the ward to the piano in the failing light. I had lit the lanterns myself that evening, more of them than usual, hung along the beams so that the long room glowed amber rather than the usual thin gray of a single lamp, and the light fell warm across the rows of cots and the bandaged men in them, most of whom had gone still, with a kind of expectant hush, sensing, as wounded men often sense such things before they are told, that something was about to happen. Clara sat on the piano's cracked leather bench, straightened her spine the way I had seen her straighten it before a difficult dressing change, and set her hands upon the yellowed keys. She did not announce what she meant to play. She simply began. The opening phrase rose soft and unhurried into the tent-warm air, a melody that seemed to lean forward on itself, tender and searching, the kind of tune that does not so much fill a room as settle over it, like a hand laid gently on a shoulder. The battered upright answered her imperfectly. That dead tenor key left a small silence where a note should have rung, and a string somewhere in the middle register buzzed faintly with each strike. But Clara played through those wounds rather than around them, adjusting her phrasing so that the gaps became breaths rather than failures, until the instrument's very brokenness seemed to become part of the music's honesty. I have heard that piece played on concert grands in drawing rooms, with better acoustics and no want of tuning, and I tell you now that I never heard it played more truly than in that farmhouse ward with the dust still settling from the day's heat. The melody rose through its first turning, that long, aching climb where the tune seems to ask a question of the listener, and I saw men who had not moved from their cots in days lift their heads. Reed, beside me, went very still, his eyes wet, and I understood he was hearing not just the tune, but the two boys who used to hum it under their breath on a dusty road, keeping step, making the miles shorter. Clara's hands did not falter. She played the answering phrase, softer now, drawing the melody down into a hush, before letting it rise again, richer, into the piece's warm second theme, and the amber lantern light caught the fine dust, still hanging in the air, so that the whole room seemed, for a moment, gilded. Down the row, a boy named Corporal Fenwick, who had lost most of his left hand to shrapnel, and wept more from shame than pain in the days since, let his working hand fall still against the blanket, and simply listened, his face unguarded for the first time I had seen it. Clara's left hand moved low over the bass notes, steady as a heartbeat beneath the melody, while her right hand shaped each phrase with a lightness that seemed to coax rather than command the old piano's worn strings. And even the buzzing note in the middle register, which might have spoiled a lesser performance, seemed instead to lend the tune an ache entirely its own. I watched Edwin. For 11 days, his eyes had fixed on that same point past the tent pole, unmoving as a photograph. Now, as the melody unspooled its second verse, I saw something shift there, some almost imperceptible focusing, as though a man long submerged were rising, slow degree by slow degree, toward the surface of the water. His good hand, which had lain across his chest for 11 days like a thing set down and forgotten, curled faintly against the blanket. His jaw, so tightly set that the orderlies had worried for his teeth, loosened by a fraction. Clara did not look at him. I understood later, when I asked her, that she had made herself not look, afraid that the weight of her own hope might somehow reach him and frighten away whatever was stirring. She kept her eyes on the keys and let the music do what music does when nothing else can, and she carried the melody into its final rising phrase, the one Reed later told me the brothers used to sing loudest, quiet as they kept it, on the last hard mile before camp each evening. It was there, in that final phrase, with the melody swelling as far as that wounded old piano could let it swell, that Edwin Larkin's stare broke. I saw it happen the way one sees a dam give way, not gradually but all at once, the stillness of 11 days collapsing in a single instant. His face, which had held itself like carved stone since the ridge, crumpled, and a sound came out of him that was not a word at first, but something older than words, a raw and broken sob, torn up from wherever he had buried it. His good arm came up and pressed across his eyes, and his shoulders shook, and the whole ward, every wounded man in it, went utterly silent around him, except for Clara's hands still moving gently over the keys, softer now, letting the melody fall away into its last tender phrase, as though she knew, without looking, exactly what she had opened. "Samuel," Edwin said. It was not loud. It was barely more than breath given shape, cracked and wet with 11 days of unshed grief. But it was a word, his brother's name, the first sound he had made since the ridge, and it broke over that ward like rain after drought. He said it again, Samuel. And then he was weeping in earnest, weeping the way a man weeps when a wound long left to fester is finally, mercifully lanced. And Clara rose from the bench before the last cord had fully faded, and crossed the room, and sat on the edge of his cot, and simply took his hand, saying nothing, letting him weep against her shoulder, while the lantern light held steady and warm over them both. I went to him too, and knelt by the cot, and I will tell you that I have given the last rites to dying men, and felt less of God's presence in the room than I felt in that farmhouse ward, while Edwin Larkin said his brother's name over and over, into a nurse's shoulder, grieving at last the way the living are meant to grieve, with sound and tears, and no more silence to carry alone. Reed was weeping too, and so were others down the row of cots, not from sorrow only, but from something nearer to relief, the way men weep when they have watched a friend drown and then, against all expectation, seen him breathe. Edwin did not stop weeping for a long while, and none of us wished him to. When at last he quieted, hoarse and spent, he looked up at Clara with eyes that had come all the way back from wherever they had gone, and he asked her, in a voice still raw from disuse, to play it again, because Samuel had always liked it best the second time through, when you knew the tune well enough to lean into it. She played it again, and this time Edwin hummed along beneath his breath, brokenly at first and then more steadily, the way he must have hummed it beside his brother on 100 dusty miles. And I understood, listening, that grief had not been erased that evening, only unburied, set free at last, to do the slow, honest work that only grief spoken aloud can do. The dust outside had settled with the falling dark. The heat had finally broken, and in a battered farmhouse ward at the edge of a war, a young nurse's hands on an old wounded piano had done what medicine alone could not, and given a silent man his brother's name back, and his own voice with it. In the weeks that followed, Edwin's recovery came the way real recovery so often does, not as a single dawn, but as a slow lightening, morning by morning. He spoke haltingly at first, then more freely, telling Reed and the others small memories of Samuel, a dog they'd once kept, a chore they'd shirked together and been caught at, the particular way their mother had scolded them both in the same breath, because she could never tell which of them had thought of the mischief first. He asked Clara to teach him the melody's simplest line on the piano's undamaged keys, and though his fingers were clumsy and his ear untrained, he practiced it each evening until he could pick it out cleanly, meaning, he told me, to play it for his mother when he went home, so that some part of Samuel might walk back into that house beside him. He was invalided home before the year turned, and I never learned whether he kept that promise. But I have thought often since of that ward at dusk, the lantern light, the wounded old piano, and a young nurse who understood that some silences cannot be reasoned with or prayed away, only sung open, gently, until the man trapped inside them remembers he was never meant to carry his grief alone.